And I published my first book from prison in 2008. As soon as I published the book, I got sued by the Department of Corrections. It was a very chaotic environment. Every day it was super noisy and they sprayed pepper spray and that just goes through the whole unit. So there was days where you would just, I would be sitting on my bunk and all of a sudden I'm coughing and it was chaos. And so for me, writing in that environment required a lot of ingenuity. One guy, he was like, yeah, send it over to me. I remember sending it under the door and thinking to myself, this is my only copy. And if you don't give it back, there's nothing I could do because we're in solitary. I didn't even hear from him for a couple of hours. So I started getting really nervous. I'm like, oh man, he's gonna keep the book. Then that's gonna turn into a whole conflict when we get back to the yard. When I think about where I was at the time that I was writing, there's a few things that comes up. There's obviously the pain of the experience. And, solitary confinement is something that I will forever advocate to have ended. I think it's the most barbaric and inhumane treatment that we can inflict on people consciously and with our tax dollars. And, I think to lock a person in a cell or a cage, for years at a time is cruel and unusual punishment. And the environment that I was in, the thing that struck me the most about it was the high level of mental health challenges that the men around me were faced with. And the way that that showed up, whether it was men who were cutting themselves so that they can get taken to a hospital and receive some type of care and comfort from somebody who treated them with, humanity, or whether it was, just the personal attacks on each other from, slinging feces on each other to sleep deprivation by banging on the toilets in their cells. It was a very chaotic environment. Every day it was super noisy and, there was always the officers coming to extract people from their cells. And, they come as 10 officers fully adorned in what looks like hockey apparel. And they would come and extract people and take them to whether the suicide watch cell or other cells, which means they spray pepper spray and that just goes through the whole unit. So there was days where you would just, I'd be sitting on my bunk and all of a sudden I'm coughing and whatever, because they're spraying pepper spray without consideration for everybody else around them. And it was chaos, and at one point I started to question whether I was actually losing it because I wasn't reactive to so many of the things that other people was reactive to. And I was like, well, maybe I'm the one who's losing it and they've got it all together. And that's the psychological challenge of being in an environment where it's so chaotic and nothing is normal and there's no idea of when you're going to get out. And so for me, writing in that environment required a lot of ingenuity. I had to rate to what's the optimum time. And typically it was once the lights were out, in the cell block, then things would kind of quiet down. And so I would stand by the window. It's a little small window at the back of my cell, and a little bit of light that filtered in, I would write from that, and then sometimes I would lay on the floor and write from the little bit of light that leaked up under the cell door. So I was always just finding different ways to do it. And then I created just kind of a consistent cadence of like, what I want my experience to be like. This is once I started realizing that, we may not be able to control our circumstances, but I believe we can always control our reaction to them. And so I began to set my cell up as if I was at university. I would study, philosophy in the morning. I would go from philosophy to, world history, from world history to African history, from African history to, Eastern philosophy. And then I would get into literature and then I would make time to just read. And then after I got done with that, then that's when I would write. So I just made sure that I kept consistently, kept my mind moving forward. I think people lose hope when they can't take that next step in their mind. And so those things allowed me to just every day to add some type of value to my life and to my experience, and really just to keep me moving forward.
What about more practical considerations such as exercise, food, water? Was that adequate when you were in there?
Well, the exercise part, that's up to you, And so I definitely, exercise every day. I would take my mattress and roll it up, and then I would tie a sheet around the mattress, and then I would loop another sheet through the mattress, and then I would curl the mattress. And
Mhm.
so that's how I would do my curls. I would do like shoulder presses. And then I would just do push-ups and other calisthenics. And so that was part of that baked in routine, just to keep my body moving forward. Meditation, that was so important to me, is like the ability to, process my mind in a way that emptied out all those negative self-defeating thoughts. Um, journaling, that was very practical. Practice for me is like to really get things out of my mind. In regards to food, we were solely reliant on whatever they were serving, so that was oftentimes not the best. The portions are very skimpy. You can't buy commissary out of the store when you're in solitary. And so the only edible thing you can buy are cough drops. And so cough drops became like candy as well as currency. But that was it. You can't save, you can't hoard food, because if they catch you with any food that you saved, basically they will put you on food restriction, and then you would get a big lump of what's called food loaf, which is all the food mashed up and baked into this brick. And so, to avoid that, you have to eat, whatever you can before you turn your tray in.
Mm. All right. So under all those conditions, you wrote your first book within 30 days. Did you know it
Yeah.
was good, or how did you get any validation? You pass it around and let the other guys read it? How does it work?
Yeah, so I remember setting very intentional, parameters for finishing the book, because when I was journaling, I realized that I had never completed anything.
Mhm.
Only thing I had completed was a GED. And so I was like, I want to challenge myself. And so I challenged myself to write this book in 30 days. And I got it done. And I remember thinking to myself, well, a book isn't a book until somebody reads it. And so I asked the guys on the cell block, I'm like, yo, anybody want to read this book, And a few guys was like, no, we don't read that, blah, blah. You ain't, this ain't Oprah's book
Most
club.
of these guys can't even really read. They're operating on the third grade reading level, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a third grade reading level. But there's surprisingly, some guys who figure out, how to get through books that resonate with them. That's why I think
Mhm.
Donald Goins was so important in Iceberg Slim. I think you put more effort into something when you can see yourself in it. And one guy, he was like, yeah, send it over to me. And I remember, like, I had to send it over on a fish line, so we would make these lines that we would attach stuff and slide it up under the door so that the other person could pull it in. And so, I remember sending it under the door and thinking to myself, this is my only copy, the last part of it slid on the door, and if you don't give it back, there's nothing I could do because we're in solitary. But I remember him getting it, and I didn't hear from him for a couple of hours. So I started getting really nervous. I'm like, oh man, he gonna keep the book. Then that's gonna turn into a whole conflict when we get back to the yard. But a
You
few hours
gotta, you
later,
gotta, you gotta turn back into the old Shaka.
got to go back to the thugging it out on the yard, and trying to avoid that at all costs. But I remember him coming back to the cell door. And he was like, "Yo, man, this is one of the best books I ever read."
Wow.
And I did like a little dance, like in my cell. I was like, yo, I did it, blah, blah. And then I had this moment of clarity. I was like, well, he's in solitary confinement. So he's probably super bored.
His judgment is a little bit skewed.
I'm like, I could have sent him a recipe over there. He'd be like, man, it's the best chicken noodle soup ever. And so, I was like, I got to get my workout. And I eventually started sending work out to one of my brothers. He's my step brother, but we don't identify the step part. He's just my older brother. His name is, we call him Kid, but his name is Will Red. And I remember sending my older brother the book out. And well, initially I sent him some short stories first. And I remember him writing me, and he had wrote me much, in prison. My older brother, he was like the one brother who had never had a brush with the system, never got caught up in the streets. He played ball for high school. He went to college. He was doing all the right things, and to this day, he's just an, incredible example for me as a father, as a husband, and all the things that he does really, he inspires me. But I remember getting a letter from him, and he was like, man, he's like, I read all this stuff, when I was in college, and, I read all these different things people wrote, and he was like, "You write better than most people I went to school with." And I was like, wow, like that validation meant something. It's like this is something, I could take serious. And so I continued writing. And then I started, once I got out of solitary, I started sharing the books in the cell block, and just that grapevine of like guys coming like, yo, man, when can I get the book next? I heard so much about it. When guys started to talk about it, that you have no connection to, they don't know nothing about you. That's when I was like, okay, I'm on to something.
Okay.
Hey, so a lot of you all have been reaching out with your guest suggestions. And look, I appreciate it. I do. And to help make it easier for those guests to say yes to my invitation, I need you to subscribe to this channel. Just hit the subscribe button below. And that's literally the best way to help me get you that guest on my podcast. All right. Thank you so much for helping out. And back to the show.
Okay. So as you're writing, um, were you recognizing any patterns? Like if I tell more stories, if I'm like completely raw and honest, that's the stuff that connects with people the most? Or were you just kind of like just stream of consciousness and just writing whatever was coming to you?
I think a lot of it was, as I talked about early, being really influenced by hip hop.
Mhm.
And, I think about, some of the artists that I've grown up loving. And the ones that always resonated with me was people who rap very cinematically. The great storytellers, the Cool G rap, the Nas's and people who are very can bring you into their world. And that really, from a storytelling structure, the way that I've approached it is that I want people to feel like they're a part of this world, that they're having the experience of the characters, that they can smell the environment, they can taste the environment, they can be grossed out, they can fall in love, they can be angry, they can be, they can laugh, like, all the things. So I think that instinct really came from reading a lot and listening to a lot of hip hop. And what I started finding consistently in the reactions to my work is people would say I felt like I was there. I felt like I was part of the experience. And so that became kind of, a thing where I was very intentional about setting the scene and really setting up those connecting points and, the metaphors and the similes that really align with that more cinematic storytelling.
At what point were you aware that you were going to get out? And what was your, when you found out and now you're writing these books and you're getting this response, what was your plan in your head, right? Before you actually walked out of those gates, what were you thinking was going to happen with all of this?
Yeah, so I was excited. When I wrote the first couple of books, and for years they were just like typed, in folders. I would carry them from, safeguard them with my everything. And during this time, there was this uptick in like literature that was coming from, communities, like real communities, like, Terry Woods, True to the Game, Sister Soldier, The Coldest Winter Ever,
Mhm.
Quan, Animal, like all these great literary, like to me, they're literary giants, right? They may not rise to what people typically frame as literary, but I think if you can communicate a reality from an environment, that makes people feel something, that makes people feel connected, that makes people feel like they can see themselves in those stories. Like that's greatness to me, and that's what they embody. And so I saw the way that they were hustling. They were hustling books, and I also come from that era where DJs would hustle, the tapes in the neighborhood. I used to DJ, and we had sell a mixtape for $2. Too Short hustling, his album out of the trunk and Masterpiece. So I knew those stories because I was reading, Vibe magazine and Source and, keeping my ear to the street. So I knew that I can get out and sell books. I just had to get out. That was the big part of it, was getting out. And that was something I didn't know. I didn't know if I was ever getting out of prison, because that's what they told me, like, you were dying here. And so the first step was getting myself out of solitary, and then getting to
And you
actually,
did that with a freaking letter.
yeah, I wrote a letter to the ward, and it was a mixture of writing a letter and reading all these philosophical books. You know, I challenged him on a philosophical idea of what the truth is. And basically what I did is I wrote the war in the letter and I said, you know, and I prefaced it with, you know, what you're going to read is my truth. And if you follow the pattern of what my experience is, they line up with exactly what I said. When I came to prison, I said I wasn't following the rules. And I've been pretty consistent with that, which means that you can agree or disagree with me not following the rules, but what you have to agree with is that I told the truth. And if you believe that the truth is the most important thing, then everything that I'm about to tell you in this letter moving forward, I would hope that you acknowledge that as truth as well. And that's when I told him, if you give me an opportunity to get out, I'm going to pursue this writing thing. I'm going to take it serious. I'm going to stop doing the things I was doing on the yard to get in trouble. And I'm going to focus on becoming, you know, the best writer that I can be. And it was the first and only time that a warden has ever directly wrote me back. And he said he was so moved by the letter and he believed my truth that he's going to advocate for me to get released from solitary. And he ended up doing that. And so it still took about 2 years because he had to go to his higher ups. But once I got out, you know, I started typing those books up. I had a little a brother's word processor. It was a Brother ML 500. I had that little word processor. You can only see like half of a sentence on that little screen. And I would just type nonstop, you know, for days on end, transferring those books to type, you know, manuscripts. And so I did that. And that's what I shared in the cell blocks, those typed manuscripts, you know. And meanwhile, I started putting a business plan together. I started kind of walking through what I wanted to happen with my writing. You know, I was very intentional about where I wanted to land at and what I wanted it to become when I got out. You know, I wrote in every genre you can think of. I started with, you know, fiction. At one point, I wrote some erotica, which turned into a whole different things because, you know, it was a mixture of me coming from being a hustler to evolving into like a real writer. And so it was like, okay, I can write and I know I can move products. So I'm gonna get out and I'm gonna hustle these books. And so, you know, I ended up meeting Senghor's mom. Senghor is my youngest son, who I write about in the book. But I met his mom while I was incarcerated, you know, and we started exchanging correspondence. And she was like, you know, what is your plan for life? And I was like, I'm happy you asked. Here's what I want to do. And I sent her a whole business plan, a whole breakdown of how I was going to disrupt the literary scene, how I was going to approach it, the places I was going to go. My goal was to get out, get a job, save that money, buy some books, take those books, hustle them everywhere I could, buy more books, hustle them, rinse and repeat. And she was like, wow, like, she's like, I'm with it. Like, let me help you, you know? And so we ended up joining forces and I actually published my first book from prison in 2008. I published Crack Volume 1. And as soon as I published the book, I got sued by the Department of Corrections for the cost of my incarceration. But I didn't let that deter me, you know, and you know, I went up for parole that same year, got denied, went back up the following year, got denied. And I decided I wasn't going back to the parole board at that point, and I was just going to do the time. And the reason I had, you know, thought about that was it was hard watching my dad, and at the time, you know, who was my girlfriend, it was hard watching them suffer. And I wanted to relieve them of getting their hopes up high, only to have them dashed by my denial of prison, you know, parole release. And so, you know, fortunately, Senghor's mom, you know, came to visit me the same day. And I sat in that visiting room and I was in tears. You know, it was heartbreaking watching her come through, you know, security and get patted down and have to take her shoes off and have to open her mouth and have to be touched and all the things. And I was like, I didn't want her to suffer through that anymore. And so when she walked in, you know, I was like, I got to break up with this woman, you know? And so, you know, as soon as she sat down, you know, I go into this whole spiel about, you know, we have to break up. And, you know, I broke down in tears and, you know, it's just let me cry and get it out. And then she was like, you're absolutely going to your next parole board here. And like, you know, you can get it together and get back up in there, but we didn't come this far to give up, you know? And so, I ended up going back, and I got paroled on that third try. And as they say, the third time was the charm. And so the first thing I did when I got out of prison, I went they took me from the prison to the parole office. I had to check in with my parole office. And, Ebony, who was Senghor's mom, she pulls up, her and my oldest son, Jay. And, there was a brother who was getting out. His name is Prince Montgomery. He was getting out the same day we had met on like the last 60 days of my sentence. And he was like, man, I'm about one of your books when I get out. And I thought he was talking about once he got home and kind of like got himself together. But he had money in his account, and they gave him that. And, he was like, yo, did your girl bring them books? And she was like, yeah, I got them in the trunk. I'm like, yo, pop that trunk, And I remember him giving me, the books were only $15. He gave me $20. I didn't have no change. I didn't have no money on me. And he was like, man, keep that extra $5, man. I'm happy to support you, So every year we celebrate our freedom anniversary, but we also celebrate the moment of my first actual hand-to-hand book sale, and I've been selling books ever since. So, yeah.
I've had family members in prison. When you get out of prison, it's hard to get an apartment. It's hard to get a car. It's hard to get a job. It's hard to get a bank account, right? Because you have to report that you're a felon in each of those cases. And so one of the biggest priorities is rebuilding and getting back on your feet financially, et cetera, especially as a man, and especially as a man in his 40s. No one's feeling sorry for you if you can't pay your bills. So a lot of your family, a lot of your friends are telling you, hey, Shaka, don't tell anybody you've been, just keep your head down, go get you a decent job. And you kind of defied all of that because you believed in yourself so much. So I just wanted to make a note of that, because I think it adds it adds context to the courage you had to have to really lean into your story and to use that.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell all my mentees that what you believe about yourself is more important than what anybody else believes about you. And when I came home, I know my family had like the best of intentions. They really wanted me to just find a job and live the rest of my life. I come from a working class community, people who work for the factories and, work in social work and things of that nature. So they just like, if you can get a job, you'll be fine. And I put in for jobs. It wasn't like I didn't come out like I can just pull magic out of the air in some random way. I knew I had to have a game plan, but it was hard to get hired, and I I would get these little random jobs. My first job actually was writing for a local newspaper. And every job that I've had since I've been out of prison have come through these very unconventional ways. I ended up posting, like I opened up a Facebook page because I knew the marketing side. I'm like, I got to get to reach the people, right? I don't know nothing about this social media. I just know it's people on there and they need to be buying my book. And I remember making a post and just saying, if there's any local artists, send me your music so I can write a music review. And I had two missions in mind. One was to get access to free music, and the other one was just to keep my writing skills sharp. And there was a woman following me at the time who was the managing editor at a local newspaper called the Michigan Citizen. And her name was Zenobia. And Zenobia was like, hey, can you do reviews for us? And I was like, sure. So I write these two reviews. And then she called me and was like, hey, come pick up your check. And I was like, what check? What are you talking about? And she's like, oh, we're paying you for those reviews. It was like $25 or something. But I was like, wow, I made some money writing these reviews. And so I just started writing. It was like a couple extra dollars coming in, $50 extra a week. I wasn't making a ton of money. I didn't have a job. And so every penny counted, And then one day she hits me up and she was like, one of our staff writers isn't available. Can you cover this story? And I went and wrote this story. It was about this man. His name is Lauren Harper, Detroit-based theater actor. And he had his movie coming out about, it's about this church, et cetera. And I remember going to interview him. And, the story of the movie that was coming out was fine. It was cool. But his story was fascinating. He had been addicted to crack cocaine for, a long time in his life. And he found theater therapeutic, and he found that art form as a means to help with his healing. And he was also running a drug rehab program and using art to help people find their way. And so I ended up writing his story. Weeks later, after the paper comes out, the managing editor, she calls me in and she gives me this stack of mail. And she's like, we've never got this much mail for an article in this newspaper. And so they just started offering me the opportunities to cover different stories. And then they allowed me to go out and find stories. So a lot of my friends to this day, I found them through writing their stories because they were small business owners. Actually, one of my best friends' name is Clement Brown Jr. He's a fashion designer, owns a store called 313. I write about him in the book. I met him writing about his business at the time. And now we've been friends for 11 years. So that's the kind of the pathway forward. Then the mentoring program, I ended up, winning that award. It came with like a $25,000 stipend. I was able to pay myself for the month, get some supplies, do the programs. And then that following year, that organization hired me as a consultant. And so it was like all these little, consulting one-offs, just enough to pay the bills, just enough to get from point A to point B while I continue writing. But it was during that time, as I was doing all these things, when people would, they would read and, hearing about, Crack Volume 1, but they would always say to me, like, you don't sound like someone who's been in prison. And they meant it as a compliment.
Yeah.
But it always dressed up something really hurtful to me, because when I was in prison, I met some of the most brilliant men in my life. And that still holds true today. And I know some incredible people. My network is full of some of the most brilliant scientists and venture capitalists and entrepreneurs and actors and writers. I met some of the most brilliant men in prison. These men are my mentors. They are the men who guided me to books. They are the men that saw something in me before I saw anything in myself. And so that bothered me, and I was like, I need to tell people about how I went to prison, because my story isn't unique. Inside our prisons in America, there is a wealth of talent, a wealth of genius. There's a wealth of creativity, entrepreneurship, and good people who unfortunately have either made decisions that landed them there because of a series of things that happened in their life, or people who were falsely accused. And so that's what inspired me to write Righting My Wrongs. And, I wrote that book, self-published that originally in 2013, and hustled it like I hustled the rest of the books. But there was something different happening with the response to that book. I started to see this uptick in this groundswell of people like, this is an important book, and this book needs to be out in the world. And so, we hustled the book. I remember sending, one person who supported me, they bought books for every prison in America. They were so moved by the book. They was like, if you put together a list of all the prisons in America, I'll write you a check to send books to them. And I remember, putting together a little crew of my friends and my brother, and, we sat in my garage and we packed, over 1,000 books and sent them to prisons. And Senghor's mom, we sent them to prisons living all over America, and so eventually I was doing a talk, and after I did the talk, there was a woman there. And this woman, her husband came up to me later on, like after the talk, sure you've done these talks where they have like the kind of happy hour room and everybody's kind of chilling after work. And I'm sitting there and this brother comes up to me, super clean cut brother, very polished. And he's like, I'm really upset with you, And I'm like, oh man, what did I say in my talk that offended him? I'm thinking he's about to be like, I'm tired of hearing these, come from the hood stories. I'm thinking he's about to lay into me, And I'm like, what's going on? How did I offend you? He's like, my wife is in the room reading your book. We supposed to be out here having fun, getting time away from the kids, and she don't want to leave the room, And so we had a laugh and, finished the night with drinks and all that. It turns out that his wife, who's now a dear friend of mine named Andrea, she used to work for Oprah. And so she took the book to Oprah.
The self-published book.
The self-published book. Yeah, the self-published one. Oprah gets the book, and she's like, why would I read this book? This guy's on the cover, with tattoos and barbed wire fences, and he's been in prison for murder. Like, why would I read this book, you know? And what Oprah said is that she took that book and kept moving it around her house because she doesn't throw books away. And
Mhm.
finally, when she was moving her operation to LA, she said, she was like, let me just take this book. So she took the book with her. She's on her plane, says she got 50 pages in, and was like, I got to interview this guy. And Oprah has gone on to say that our interview was one of the best in her, not just in her career, but in her life. And that, you know, Righting My Wrongs is one of her favorite books of all time, one of her favorite memoirs. She said it was her favorite memoir until Will Smith dropped his memoir. So I might have got bumped down. I don't know yet. But but it
What
was
was that day like when you got that call? Was it Andrea that called you, or Oprah's other people that called you?
so Andrea called me first and was
Mhm.
like, you know, Oprah wants to interview you. She wants you to come out to Hawaii. And I was just like, well, what actually happened was, so Andrea calls me. She comes to an unknown number at the time. I answer it because I answer all unknown numbers at the time. I'm like, you know, I it might be some business, it might be some bills I owe. I don't know which one, but let me gamble. Answer the call. She's like, hey, Shaka, I'm going to talk to you, blah, blah. And then the phone disconnects.
Mhm.
And she calls me the next day. And she's like, I'm so sorry. Something was going on with the kids, blah, blah, blah. She was like, but I was calling you because Oprah wants to interview you and I'm going to connect you to her producer. Um, and I was like, wow, she wants you to come to Hawaii. So she connects me to the producer. Producer is like, yes, she wants you to come, this, that, and the other. So I set it up. So I'm hyped. I'm like, yo, I'm going to Hawaii. I ain't never been. Only thing I've ever seen is like Hawaii 5-0 when I was a kid. And so I'm hyped up. I got this idea of how I'm gonna be greeted getting off the plane. And the producer calls back and like, Oprah doesn't want you to come to Hawaii. So my heart literally just sank.
If you like that video, you're going to love the next one. Click this thumbnail right here, and I'll see you over there.